Hello everyone, and welcome back to the third installment in our Introduction to Marxism series. Today we shall be discussing dialectical and historical materialism, which are central concepts in the Marxist theory of history and society. The text I recommended for today was Socialism, Utopian and Scientific by Friedrich Engels, specifically section 3, but I might make reference to a couple of other sections. This is going to be a quite philosophical and abstract lesson, but I think you'll enjoy it. So let's start by just looking at the term historical materialism. There are two parts, history and materialism, right? So I assume we all know what history is, so let's look a bit more at materialism. Materialism holds that the world and phenomena in the world are determined by material forces and physical reality. This stands in opposition to idealism, which states that the world is shaped by powerful ideas or subjective consciousness. So why do Marxists place emphasis on materialism instead of idealism? Well, Marx and Engels set out to develop a scientific theory of how society functions and how it developed. And science takes a materialist worldview. Science assumes that reality functions independent of human consciousness. Thus, for example, gravity exists whether you believe in it or not. There is an objective physical reality which can exist even without human consciousness, and the ideas that humans have do not change, for instance, the laws of physics. So how does this apply when we think about society and history? Well, idealists would view historical events as the outcome of great historical figures or personalities and their ideas about the world, whereas a materialist would view history as a result of economic relations in society or the development of productive forces. And for Marx and Engels specifically, they view class struggle as the primary motive force of history. You'll remember we read that famous sentence in the Communist Manifesto, which says that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. So Engels sums this up quite nicely at the start of section 3 of his book by saying that, quote, "The materialist conception of history starts from the proposition that the production of the means to support human life and, next to production, the exchange of things produced, is the basis of all social structure, that in every society that has appeared in history, the manner in which wealth is distributed and society divided into classes or orders is dependent upon what is produced, how it is produced, and how the products are exchanged. From this point of view, the final causes of all social changes and political revolutions are to be sought not in men's brains, not in men's better insights into eternal truth and justice, but in changes in the modes of production and exchange. They are to be sought not in the philosophy, but in the economics of each particular epoch." Now, I also mentioned dialectical materialism at the start of this lesson. So what does the term dialectical mean? Well, the idea of a dialectic has been used for a long time by many different philosophers, going back all the way even to ancient Greece. And Engels brings up a few important points about dialectics in section 2 of his book. Firstly, he starts by saying that in a dialectical worldview, everything is constantly in flux and changing. And secondly, he points out that all things are essentially interconnected in some way. This means that you cannot understand one phenomenon in isolation. You have to look at its relations to other things, how it affects those other things, and how those other things affect it. Remember when we were talking about the Marxist conception of class, we also mentioned that relations were very important. So to give you an example of such a dialectical relationship, let's consider the famous materialist theory of base and superstructure. Okay, so in this theory, the base, or the economic base, is the means of production and the relations of production, how society is organized economically. So what the different classes are, the state of class struggle in society, and so on. Whereas the superstructure refers to basically everything that doesn't have to do with this production and usually the realm of ideas. So things like cultural expressions, religious expressions, dominant ideology, the way the media interacts, the political system, the education, and so on. Now, not only does the base form the superstructure, but the superstructure can actually shape the base as well. In other words, they counter-influence each other. So remember what Walter Rodney said in our very first lesson. He said that socialist ideas are derived from the same relations of production as bourgeois ideas. But of course, when socialist ideas spread, we know that they can start to threaten capitalism and eventually uproot and overturn the economic relations and the economic system, i.e. the base. So there is a dialectical relationship between these two things because they are influencing each other and have the ability to change each other. Now, another fundamental part of dialectics is the idea of contradictions. You can think of that as being similar to having opposite parts of one whole, although it's not entirely the same. But Engels gives us an example of such a contradiction. He writes, quote, "In like manner, every organized being is every moment the same and not the same. Every moment it assimilates matter supplied from without and gets rid of other matter. Every moment some cells of its body die and others build themselves anew. In a longer or shorter time, the matter of its body is completely renewed and is replaced by other molecules of matter, so that every organized being is always itself and yet something other than itself." And later Marxists, such as Lenin and Mao, give further examples of such contradictions in nature. For example, in mechanics there's action and reaction, in chemistry there is combination and dissociation of atoms, in mathematics you can find integrals and derivatives, and so on. Now, when we consider a capitalist society or any class society, we would consider the class struggle in capitalism, that's between, of course, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, as we discussed last time. We would consider that to be a very important contradiction, perhaps the most important contradiction. Okay, but why are we even placing so much stock in dialectics? Well, once again, Engels claims that dialectics are essentially the expression of how nature in the world actually works, and thus they're scientific, and he brings up Darwinian evolution as an example. So he writes again, quote, "Nature is the proof of dialectics, and it must be said for modern science that it has furnished this proof with very rich materials increasingly daily, and thus has shown that, in the last resort, nature works dialectically and not metaphysically, that she does not move in the eternal oneness of a perpetually recurring circle, but goes through a real historical evolution. In this connection, Darwin must be named before all others. He dealt the metaphysical conception of nature the heaviest blow by his proof that all organic beings, plants, animals, and man himself are the products of a process of evolution going on through millions of years." So we see that the theory of evolution works dialectically, essentially. It says that all species are constantly changing, evolving, and going through development. And we could see many other natural phenomena in the same way, in fact. For example, the universe is constantly expanding and changing, and it's gone through various phases of development throughout its history. Okay, so we've broken down dialectical materialism into its parts, but let's take a more macroscopic view now. If you use dialectical materialism to analyze a society, then you look at the material, i.e. economic, conditions of that society, and you look at the contradictions in the mode of production. For example, in the capitalist mode of production, there is a fundamental contradiction between social production and private accumulation, and Engels places a lot of emphasis on this. So he says, and I'm sorry, this is a very long quote, it's going to be spread across 3 slides, but it is important that you understand this, and you need the context of the whole thing, I think. So let's just start with it. He says, quote, "Then came the concentration of the means of production and of the producers in large workshops and manufactories, their transformation into actual socialized means of production and socialized producers. But the socialized producers and means of production and their products were still treated after this change just as they had been before, that is, as the means of production and the products of individuals. Hitherto, the owner of the instruments of labor had himself appropriated the product, because as a rule it was his own product and the assistance of others was the exception. Now the owner of the instruments of labor always appropriated to himself the product, although it was no longer his product, but exclusively the product of the labor of others. Thus, the products now produced socially were not appropriated by those who had actually set in motion the means of production and actually produced the commodities, but by the capitalists. The means of production and production itself had become in essence socialized, but they were subjected to a form of appropriation which presupposes the private production of individuals, under which therefore everyone owns his own product and brings it to market. The mode of production is subjected to this form of appropriation, although it abolishes the conditions upon which the latter rests. This contradiction, which gives to the new mode of production its capitalistic character, contains the germ of the whole of the social antagonisms of today. The greater the mastery obtained by the new mode of production over all important fields of production and in all manufacturing countries, the more it reduced individual production to an insignificant residuum, the more clearly was brought out the incompatibility of socialized production with capitalistic appropriation. Okay, so what Engels is saying here is that in a capitalist society, many individuals work together, so we have social production, but only a small number of individuals who don't actually produce the products, right? Like, think of a factory owner doesn't usually actually end up working the machinery to produce the finished product, but the factory owners appropriate those products which other people produced, all working together. And this is very different to cottage industries under feudalism, where a single person would produce a product from start to finish, and then they would exchange it on the market. So they had private production, they produced their own things, and they had private appropriation. But now there exists this contradiction between social production and private accumulation. Now, there are other contradictions inherent to capitalism, which Marx and Engels talk about, and we'll explore more about that in part 5 when we read Wage, Labor, and Capital and talk a bit about Marxian economics. But Marx and Engels think that these contradictions will lead to greater crises of capitalism, and they will eventually have to be resolved, well, essentially by the end of capitalism, because they think the capitalist system can't overcome these contradictions because of its own nature. And this will happen in the same way that feudal contradictions were resolved by the end of feudalism. Well, not entirely the same way, but in a similar way. And we can get an even larger picture, an even larger view when we apply the dialectical materialist view to history. And this is, in essence, what historical materialism is. This leads to a historical narrative in which humanity has passed through various stages of development, various modes of production, including slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and so on. And each of these modes of production arises with its own set of contradictions, resulting from the class struggle. Remember that class struggle is the motive force of history. Class struggle is what makes history happen, essentially. And each of these has passed away, or in the case of capitalism, Marx and Engels predict that it will pass away. And they've passed away due to their own internal contradictions, which they could not resolve, and then they gave rise to a new mode of production. Now, at the end of this book, Engels provides a summary of how society developed out of medieval feudalism into capitalism, and he makes predictions about the future proletarian revolution and communist society. Now, we'll look into socialism and communism a bit more in the next lesson. For now, I do want to bring up a relevant critique of Marx and Engels' work and this idea of historical evolution that Engels is pointing out. The critique is that this view is essentially Eurocentric, and as people living in Africa, we need to think about the way that African societies have existed and developed historically, because not all societies have developed in the same way that Engels lays out, or that Marx talks about in Capital Volume 1, for instance. Most African countries did not become part of the global capitalist system through their own historical development. Instead, they were incorporated into that system by Western colonialism and imperialism. At the time when Africa was colonized, different countries were at different levels of development. For example, in some parts of West Africa, there were already feudal kingdoms with a relatively high level of technological development, including, they had universities, they were already mining minerals, they could navigate complex trade routes, and so on. But in other parts of the continent, there were still people living in a essentially nomadic pastoral community. And this comes back to what I said in the first lesson about applying Marxism to different societies at different times. The analysis that Marx and Engels made of Western European society must naturally be adjusted for our own South African society. So we need to grasp our own historical evolution because it is not the same one that Engels outlines in his book. So thank you for listening, and we'll now go to discussion plus Q&A.